Imagine a European emperor sitting in Paris, plotting to crown an Austrian archduke in Mexico. It sounds crazy, like the setup of a dark political comedy, but in the mid-1800s, it was deadly serious. The conflict we called the Franco-Mexican War was all at once imperial ambition, financial quarrel, and clash of ideas. And yet, for most people outside Mexico, it remains overshadowed by larger wars of the century. Today, its echoes linger in surprising places, most famously in the annual celebration of Cinco de Mayo, often misunderstood as Mexican Independence Day. But before we reach that battlefield, we must rewind to understand how such a strange war could even begin. This wasn't the first time France and Mexico collided. Just 2 decades earlier, French troops had already landed on Mexican shores during the so-called Pastry War, a conflict sparked by a claim from a French pastry chef in Mexico City. That earlier clash ended quickly, but it left behind hurt, pride, and unfinished business. For Napoleon III, nephew of the great Bonaparte and ruler of France, Mexico was not merely a far-flung state in turmoil. It was a tempting stage on which to project imperial power, to revive the glory of France, and perhaps to reshape the balance of empires across the Atlantic. On the surface, the excuse was simple: unpaid debts. Mexico had borrowed heavily from European powers, and repayment seemed unlikely in a country battered by civil war. Britain, Spain, and France all had legitimate complaints. But Napoleon saw opportunity where others saw mere accounting. His ambitions went far beyond compensation. He dreamed of planting a European monarch in the Americas, creating a Catholic Latin empire that could counterbalance the growing power of the Protestant United States. And so, in the early 1860s, as the United States bled in its own civil war, French ships set sail for Veracruz. What began as a joint effort among Europe's great powers would soon fracture into a French gamble, a gamble that would drag in not only armies and generals but emperors, archdukes, and one of Mexico's most stubborn leaders, Benito Juárez. The Franco-Mexican War was never destined to be a clean contest of armies. It was a war of mismatched ambitions between a European emperor seeking glory, a Mexican republic struggling for survival, and a Habsburg prince seduced by the illusion of destiny. To understand how a man from Vienna ended up wearing Mexico's crown and why his reign collapsed so violently, we begin with Mexico itself, a nation fractured by deep divisions long before French soldiers ever set foot on its soil. When French ships eventually appeared off Mexico's coast, they were sailing toward a nation already torn apart. Between 1857 and 1861, Mexico had been consumed by what became known as the War of Reforma, civil war that was less about territory than about the very soul of the nation. On one side stood the conservatives, defenders of old hierarchies. They championed the Catholic Church, whose vast estates and wealth dominated Mexican life. For them, the Church was not just a spiritual anchor but the backbone of society. They also clung to centralized government, to order over liberty, believing that Mexico's fragile republic could only survive under the guidance of elites. Opposite them stood the liberals, inspired by ideals of democracy, equality, and a modern state free from clerical dominance. They were lawyers, intellectuals, and reformers who saw Mexico's future in secular education, in dismantling the Church's economic stranglehold, and in empowering ordinary citizens. To them, the privileges of priests and aristocrats were chains that kept Mexico from progress. This was more than a clash of political programs, it was a civil war of visions. Entire towns split along these lines. In villages, priests called on parishioners to defend their faith, while liberal leaders promised freedom from oppression. Indigenous communities, long exploited under both church and state, found themselves courted by both sides but often betrayed by each. The conflict was brutal, stretching across mountains, plains, and cities. Families were divided, fortunes ruined, and Mexico's already fragile economy driven to collapse. By 1861, after 4 years of bloody struggle, it was the liberals under Benito Juárez who emerged victorious. Juárez, a Zapotic from Oaxaca who rose from poverty to the presidency, embodied the liberal ideal of merit over privilege. His triumph was a symbol of resilience, an indigenous man standing at the head of a republic determined to modernize itself. But victory came at a price. The conservatives had been defeated, yet their networks of influence remained. The church seethed at its losses, and Mexico's treasury was empty, drained by years of war. In theory, Juárez had restored peace. In reality, he inherited a country scarred, suspicious, and vulnerable nation where the embers of civil conflict still glowed beneath the surface, ready to ignite once more. By the time Benito Juárez stood triumphant in Ibalioyi, the battlefield had fallen quiet, but the silence was deceiving. The Reform War had left Mexico not in peace but in ruins. Cities bore scars of sieges, farmland lay untended, and an entire generation of young men had been consumed by civil strife. The republic Juárez inherited was both exhausted and exposed. The most urgent problem was money. To keep their armies marching, both liberals and conservatives had borrowed recklessly from abroad. Loans flowed in from Britain, Spain, and France, each eager to protect their interests in the New World. But with the conservatives defeated, creditors turned to the liberals to settle not only their own debts but also those of their enemies. Juárez. This seemed absurd. Why should a fragile republic, barely holding itself together, shoulder the cost of its defeated foes? Yet to Europe, a debt was a debt. The treasury, however, was nearly empty. Revenues had collapsed during the war, trade had withered, and silver, the lifeblood of Mexico's economy, had fallen into foreign hands. Juárez made the bitter choice to suspend debt payments for 2 years in order to stabilize the nation. For ordinary Mexicans, this pause was a matter of survival. Teachers needed wages, soldiers needed pay, and families needed relief after years of devastation. But in the eyes of Europe's monarchies, Juárez's decree was an act of defiance. Meanwhile, Mexican society groaned under the weight of inequality. Wealth remained concentrated in the hands of a few landowners and the church. Even as liberal reforms sought to break that monopoly, rural peasants, indigenous communities, and urban workers still lived precariously, many trapped in cycles of debt peonage that bordered on servitude. For them, the promises of the liberal triumph felt distant, abstract words spoken in Congress halls while hunger gnawed at their homes. The war had also fractured Mexico's image abroad. To European observers, it looked like a republic unable to govern itself, lurching from one crisis to the next. Newspapers in Paris and London painted Mexico as unstable, a land perpetually on the brink of collapse. For opportunists like Napoleon III, such narratives provided a justification. If Mexico could not manage its affairs, perhaps it needed the guiding hand of Europe. Thus, even in victory, Juárez stood on treacherous ground. His government was legitimate, his ideals were lofty. But his enemies were not defeated. They were regrouping in exile, whispering of restoration. And across the Atlantic, powerful nations were watching, calculating, and preparing to act. When Juárez announced the suspension of debt payments in 1861, the echo carried far across the Atlantic. In Europe's courts and ministries, the decree was not heard as a practical measure of survival, it was read as provocation. To monarchs and ministers, Mexico was a debtor refusing to honor obligations. To bankers, it was a dangerous precedent, and to Napoleon III it was an opening. Within months, Britain, Spain, and France formed an unlikely alliance. Officially, their purpose was modest: compel repayment and protect their citizens abroad. In reality, each had its own designs. Britain's merchants demanded protection for trade routes and investments. Spain, nostalgic for its lost empire, saw an opportunity to reassert influence in its former colony. And France, under Napoleon III, carried ambitions far larger than balance sheets. In December 1861, European fleets appeared off the Gulf Coast. At Veracruz, the sight of warships flying 3 different flags sent ripples of anxiety through the Mexican public. The city, already scarred by years of war, braced for occupation. When troops disembarked, Spanish Marines in crisp uniforms, British redcoats, and French soldiers in blue tunics, it was clear that Mexico was once again the stage for foreign designs. At first, Juárez's government sought negotiation. After all, Mexico was in no condition to fight 3 empires at once. Talks produced the London Convention, an agreement meant to limit intervention strictly to debt collection. On paper, this was reassuring. In practice, suspicion ran deep. Could these powers really resist the temptation to seize more than coins and contracts?
For Britain and Spain, the answer soon became clear. As their commanders spoke with French envoys, they realized Napoleon's intentions stretched far beyond the ledger. He was not content to collect arrears. He wanted to reshape Mexico itself. The plan, whispered in his palace in Paris, was now surfacing: to establish a European-backed monarchy in the Americas, a Catholic empire to rival the rising United States. Britain, pragmatic and wary of provoking Washington, recoiled. Spain, though initially tempted, also hesitated at becoming a junior partner in French adventures. Within months, both withdrew their forces, leaving Napoleon standing alone, but also unrestrained. What began as a united front of European creditors dissolved into a French gamble, one that would soon plunge Mexico into yet another war. When Britain and Spain withdrew, their ships fading into the Atlantic horizon, Napoleon III remained. For him, Mexico was never about debts, it was about destiny. In Paris, the Emperor of the French imagined himself as heir to Napoleon Bonaparte's legacy, a ruler who could restore France's prestige by shaping the world beyond Europe. Mexico was to be his stage. The United States was distracted, torn apart by its own civil war. For Napoleon, this was the perfect moment. If America had proclaimed the Monroe Doctrine, that no European power should interfere in the Western Hemisphere, what better time to challenge it than when the Union was bleeding itself dry at Antietam and Gettysburg? France could seize what the Americans could not defend, but conquest for its own sake was risky. To cloak ambition in legitimacy, Napoleon needed a monarch who could stand as the rightful ruler of Mexico. His eyes turned to the House of Habsburg, whose history in the New World stretched back to the days of the Spanish Empire. There, in Vienna, lived a young Archduke, Maximilian, the younger brother of Austria's emperor. Maximilian was a romantic, tall, elegant, and cultured. He had been raised in palaces but carried an almost naive fascination with ideas of liberal reform and chivalric duty. He dreamed of being more than a spare prince in Vienna's gilded halls. To Mexican monarchists, defeated conservatives who longed for stability under a crown, Maximilian looked like salvation. To Napoleon, he looked like the perfect puppet emperor, yet there was irony in the choice. Maximilian's ideals, his belief in limited work hours, abolition of peonage, and social reform, were far closer to Juárez's liberal program than to the conservative faction inviting him. But that contradiction would come later, for now the stage was being set. Napoleon's agents promised Maximilian that Mexico longed for him, that its people desired a monarch, that a throne awaited if only he had the courage to claim it. Reports were embellished, petitions exaggerated, elections forged. The reality, that much of Mexico remained staunchly Republican, was quietly ignored. In 1862, while Napoleon whispered promises into Maximilian's ear, French troops were already advancing inland. Veracruz had fallen, roads to the capital lay open. Yet Mexico, fractured and weary as it was, would not simply bow. Napoleon's hidden agenda was about to collide with the grit of a people who refused to be ruled from afar. On a misty December morning in 1861, sails appeared on the horizon off the coast of Veracruz. As dawn broke, the people of the old port city watched 3 European flags ripple in the sea wind: Spain, Britain, and France. The coalition had arrived. The landing was swift and met with little resistance. Veracruz, weary from years of conflict, could not muster the strength to defy them. Around 6,000 European troops disembarked: Spanish Marines, disciplined British redcoats, and French soldiers in their dark blue tunics and red trousers. On the Mexican side, barely 3,000 men could be gathered, and their weapons were a mismatched collection of muskets, old cannons, and rifles scavenged from civil war. Outnumbered and outgunned, they fell back rather than risk destruction. As the Europeans advanced inland, they captured 3 towns with ease. To outside observers, it seemed Mexico would crumble quickly. Reports sent back to Europe described a disorganized republic, its soldiers ill-fed and its officers demoralized. Napoleon's ministers were confident. Mexico could be seized with minimal bloodshed, and Maximilian's throne prepared. Yet beneath this surface of easy conquest lay a different reality. Veracruz was not the whole of Mexico. Behind the hills and plains, resistance was forming, built not only on the strength of armies but on pride and defiance. The Mexican people, still scarred by the Reform War, were determined not to exchange domestic turmoil for foreign subjugation. In early 1862, reinforcements from France arrived, this time with a different purpose. The pretense of mere debt collection began to peel away. A new French commander, General Charles de Laurences, took charge. His orders were not to negotiate, but to conquer. Veracruz was only the first step. From there, the French eyed Puebla, and beyond it, the beating heart of Mexico City. At first, the European alliance appeared united, their banners fluttering side by side as troops marched inland. But behind the facade of cooperation, cracks were already forming. Britain and Spain had come to Mexico for a simple purpose: recover debts, protect their citizens, and leave. France, however, had no intention of leaving. As the weeks passed, it became clear to the British and Spanish commanders that Napoleon III's ambitions reached far beyond the agreements made in London. French officers spoke less about repayment and more about reorganizing Mexico's government. Rumors circulated that Paris intended to place a European prince on the throne. What was meant to be a limited intervention was becoming something far more dangerous: a colonial project in the Americas. Britain recoiled first. London had no appetite for an entanglement that might provoke the United States. Though still locked in its own civil war, America had never wavered in its defense of the Monroe Doctrine, which declared the Western Hemisphere off-limits to European empires. To challenge it openly was to risk confrontation once the Union re-emerged from its struggle. For Britain, Mexico was not worth a quarrel with Washington. Spain, too, realized the futility. Madrid had entertained dreams of reclaiming some influence in its former colony, but playing junior partner to France in a reckless imperial venture did not appeal. Spanish troops began preparing their departure. By spring of 1862, both Spain and Britain had signed their exit papers and set sail for home. And so, on Mexican soil, only one flag remained. The tricolor of France now stood alone, no longer shielded by allies, no longer bound by restraint. Napoleon's gamble had shed its mask of diplomacy. What began as a joint expedition had transformed into a solitary crusade, driven by one man's vision of empire. For Mexico, this was both a relief and a menace. The withdrawal of Spain and Britain narrowed the battlefield, but it also left the nation face to face with France, a great power determined to bend Mexico to its will. The next step would test whether Napoleon's ambitions could withstand the reality of Mexican resistance. With Britain and Spain gone, General Charles de Lorenzez marched deeper into Mexico, carrying Napoleon's ambitions on his shoulders. His force, some 6,000 strong, was disciplined, modern, and confident. The French army had defeated powers across Europe. Why should a battered republic, still staggering from civil war, be any different? Lorenzez saw his columns advance through the valleys and plains, brushing aside local garrisons and scattering poorly armed militias. To French officers, it seemed a confirmation of what they already believed. Mexico would collapse at the first push. But the ease of their progress also bred arrogance. Reports were sent back to Paris declaring that a swift victory was inevitable, that French soldiers would soon parade through Mexico City. Yet Mexico was not empty ground. Behind the hills and villages, General Ignacio Zaragoza, commander of the Army of the East, was preparing. His force was smaller, barely 4,500 men, and poorly equipped. But what they lacked in numbers, they made up for in resolve. Zaragoza was young, only 33, but his calm leadership inspired confidence among his troops, many of them campesinos and indigenous fighters who had never marched beyond their hometowns. As Lorenzez pushed inland, skirmishes broke out. Small bands of Mexican cavalry harassed French columns, striking from behind hills before vanishing into the countryside. These encounters were minor in scale but heavy in meaning. Mexico would not yield without a fight. The land itself seemed to resist. The rough terrain, the searing heat, the long supply line stretching back to Veracruz. By late April 1862, the French advance brought them to the valley of Puebla, a city lying astride the road to Mexico City. Whoever controlled Puebla controlled the gateway to the capital. Zaragoza positioned his men on the high ground overlooking the city, fortifying the slopes of the Laredo and Guadalupe hills. His army waited behind makeshift defenses, determined to hold. For Lorenzez, Puebla appeared to be just another obstacle. Confident in French superiority, he resolved to storm the heights head-on. The clash that followed would defy expectations and echo through history as the day Mexico, against all odds, stood firm. On the morning of May 5, 1862, storm clouds gathered over Puebla. General Zaragoza's men stood behind their earthworks, muskets ready, nerves taut. Across the plain, Lorenzez's 6,000 French troops advanced with the confidence of veterans who had bested Europe's strongest armies. To them, this was to be a swift, decisive victory. The French struck from the north, climbing the slopes toward the forts of Laredo and Guadalupe. But the Mexicans, though fewer and less equipped, held firm. Cannons roared from the hilltops, tearing gaps into the French columns. Twice, Lorenzez ordered fresh assaults, bringing in reserves and even attempting a flanking maneuver from the east. Twice, the Mexicans repelled them. Mud from the rain slowed French advances, while the defenders, fighting on familiar ground, stood unshaken. By afternoon, Lorenzez pressed for a third assault, but his artillery had run dangerously low on ammunition. When the drums beat and the bugles sounded, the French soldiers surged forward without the cover of cannon fire, straight into withering musket volleys from above. This final attack collapsed in chaos. Then came Zaragoza's counterstroke. Mexican cavalry charged from both flanks, sabers flashing, while infantry surged down the slopes. The French line buckled under the pressure, and what began as a disciplined advance dissolved into a retreat. Lawrence's army staggered back across the plain, leaving hundreds dead and wounded. Against every expectation, Mexico had won. A poorly armed force of 4,500 had defeated one of Europe's most professional armies. The victory was not decisive in the war. French reinforcements would soon return, but it was electrifying. Across Mexico, the news spread like wildfire, a symbol of defiance, proof that foreign invaders could be beaten. And so Cinco de Mayo entered history. Outside Mexico, it is often mistaken for Independence Day. In truth, it marked something different. A moment when courage and determination overcame impossible odds, when a fragile republic reminded the world that it would not bow easily to empire. For Napoleon III, Puebla was an embarrassment. For Juárez and the Republic, it was a rallying cry. The war was far from over, but on that day, under stormy skies, Mexico had written a story of pride that endures to this day. The defeat at Puebla shocked Paris. How? Could Napoleon III's proud army, victors at Magenta and Solferino, be humbled by an outnumbered force of campesinos and hastily trained militias? For Napoleon, retreat was not an option. His prestige, his imperial dream, even the credibility of France itself were on the line. He resolved to return, not with a token force, but with an army that would crush Mexico's resistance once and for all. In early 1863, General Élie-Frédéric Faure replaced Lawrence. Unlike his predecessor, Faure was methodical and cautious, not prone to rash assaults. He arrived at Veracruz with a colossal force, nearly 26,000 troops, accompanied by artillery, engineers, and supplies for a drawn-out campaign. For Mexico, this was no longer a raid. It was an invasion. Faure marched once more toward Puebla. This time, Zaragoza was gone, dead of illness only months after his triumph. His absence left a void. Still, Mexican defenders stood ready, digging trenches and fortifying positions. But they faced a siege unlike any they had endured before. Beginning in March 1863, the French encircled Puebla. For 2 grueling months, the city became a crucible of hunger, disease, and relentless bombardment. Shells crashed into homes and churches, reducing entire neighborhoods to rubble. Food grew scarce. Defenders rationed every crumb. Women and children carried water under fire, while priests blessed the fallen in makeshift chapels among the ruins. Several desperate attempts at relief failed as Republican forces outside the city were repelled. Inside Puebla, hope flickered and dimmed. Some defenders slipped out at night to raid French lines. Others fell in desperate sorties that accomplished little. At last, with no supplies left and thousands sick or wounded, the garrison surrendered in May 1863. This time, the tricolor did not retreat. French troops marched triumphantly into the battered city. The road to Mexico City now lay open. Juárez, refusing to yield, ordered the government to evacuate the capital. On June 7, 1863, French troops entered Mexico's heart. For Napoleon III, it was vindication. For Mexico, it was the beginning of a new and darker chapter: occupation. When Puebla fell in May 1863, the road to the capital lay wide open. Juárez, ever pragmatic, understood the danger. To remain in Mexico City would mean capture, perhaps execution, and the symbolic death of the Republic. On May 31st, he and his government abandoned the city, carrying the nation's fragile legitimacy with them as they rode north toward Chihuahua. It was a desperate journey into the mountains, but Juárez knew that as long as he lived, the Republic lived too. A week later, on June 7, 1863, the French entered Mexico City. Soldiers in blue and red marched through streets that had once echoed with cries for independence. The capital's great plazas filled with flags. The city's aristocrats, long sympathetic to the conservative cause, welcomed the occupiers with banquets and ceremonies. To them, the French represented not humiliation but salvation, a promise of order, stability, and restoration of the old hierarchies they believed liberal reforms had shattered. Yet, beneath the pomp of parades, tension simmered. Ordinary citizens watched in silence, wary of this new empire rising on their soil. For many, the presence of foreign troops was not stability but an insult, a reminder that Mexico's sovereignty was being auctioned to the highest bidder. For Napoleon III, the fall of Mexico City was a triumph. At last, his gamble seemed to be paying off. With the capital secured, the time had come to transform occupation into empire. He needed a crown, a monarch who could drape this conquest in legitimacy. And across the ocean, in the palaces of Vienna, a reluctant archduke was being persuaded that destiny awaited him in the New World. In Vienna, far from the dust and gunfire of Mexico, a young Habsburg prince walked through marble halls with the air of a dreamer. Archduke Ferdinand Maximilian, younger brother of Emperor Franz Joseph of Austria, was tall, refined, and cultured. He adored the arts, collected rare plants, and spoke of enlightened reform. Yet beneath the polished surface was a restless soul, a man who longed for purpose beyond being the spare in a dynasty of emperors. It was to this man that Napoleon's envoys came, carrying promises wrapped in gold and illusion. They told Maximilian that Mexico yearned for him, that its people cried out for a monarch to heal their divisions. Petitions, many forged, some coerced, were presented as evidence of unanimous support. A carefully staged plebiscite claimed overwhelming numbers in favor of his rule. In truth, most Mexicans had never been asked. But Maximilian, ever eager to believe in noble causes, was persuaded. Still, he hesitated. He was not naive about the risks. His wife, Carlotta of Belgium, daughter of King Leopold, urged him toward the crown. Ambitious and politically shrewd, she saw Mexico as a stage where she and her husband could shine, free from the shadow of Vienna. Together, they envisioned themselves as enlightened sovereigns, bringing progress to a distant land. Napoleon sweetened the offer with guarantees. French troops would secure the empire, Mexican conservatives would provide support, and Europe would recognize his throne. Maximilian's liberal instincts, his belief in abolishing forced labor, in limiting the church's power, in promoting education, were not seen as obstacles but as virtues that could modernize Mexico under imperial guidance. What was ignored, of course, was the contradiction. His reforms would alienate the very conservative elites who had invited him. In October 1863, after months of persuasion and flattery, Maximilian accepted the Mexican crown. He would not sail at once, but the die was cast. The son of Europe's most storied dynasty would cross the ocean to rule a nation that had not asked for him, enthroned by foreign bayonets. As he stood on the balcony of his palace in Trieste, gazing toward the Adriatic, perhaps Maximilian imagined himself a bridge between the old world and the new. What he could not see was the storm awaiting him in the mountains of Mexico, where Republicans sharpened their resolve and peasants whispered that a foreign emperor would never rule their soil. When Maximilian finally arrived in Mexico in 1864, the journey itself felt like a triumph. French soldiers lined the roads, cannons thundered in salute, and in Mexico City, processions were staged to welcome the new emperor and his wife, Empress Carlota. To many conservatives, it seemed their long-awaited dream had come true. A monarch restored, blessed by Europe, standing beneath the gilded canopy of empire. But Maximilian was no ordinary monarch. Educated in the liberal traditions of mid-19th century Europe, he believed a ruler's duty was not only to preserve order, but to uplift his people. He shocked his conservative supporters almost immediately. He abolished peonage, the semi-feudal system that bound peasants in perpetual debt to their landlords. He limited working hours, banned child labor, and promoted secular education. He sought to open Mexico to science, modern industry, and a merit-based civil service. For the poor and marginalized, these reforms offered hope, but they came tangled in bitter irony. Maximilian owed his throne to Mexico's conservatives, and these very policies enraged them. The wealthy landowners, the clergy, and the old aristocracy felt betrayed. They had invited a monarch to restore their privileges, not dismantle them. To the liberals, meanwhile, Maximilian was still a usurper, a European prince imposed by foreign bayonets no matter how enlightened his ideas. Carlota, fiercely devoted to her husband's vision, became his closest advisor. She wrote letters urging European courts to support the empire, toured the provinces with regal confidence, and spoke passionately of Mexico's destiny under enlightened rule. Yet, even her presence could not mask the contradictions at the heart of their reign. Maximilian dreamed of being a reformer king in a land torn by war. But every law he passed, every decree he signed, seemed to alienate one side without winning the loyalty of the other. The conservatives simmered with resentment. The liberals sharpened their resistance. Between them stood an emperor, idealistic enough to believe he could unite Mexico, yet blind to the fact that both factions saw him as an obstacle to their true vision of the nation. It was a paradox too fragile to last. Though French bayonets still guarded his throne, Maximilian's empire rested on foundations that were already cracking. The next years would reveal just how quickly ideals could collapse under the weight of politics, betrayal, and war. At first, the empire seemed to stand on firm ground. With French bayonets and disciplined European officers, Maximilian's regime expanded across Mexico. Imperial and French forces captured key strongholds in the west, securing Sinaloa and Jalisco, and raised the emperor's banner over cities once loyal to the Republic. To foreign observers, it looked as if Mexico was stabilizing under its new crown. Maximilian rode at the head of parades, Carlota by his side, presenting themselves as benevolent sovereigns. In Mexico City, grand ceremonies blended European pomp with Mexican tradition. Courtiers proclaimed a new golden age, and French newspapers carried flattering accounts of the Habsburg prince civilizing a chaotic land. For Napoleon III, it was vindication, proof that his gamble was working. But away from the plazas and palaces, the empire's victories were fragile. Beyond the cities, in mountains and villages, the Republican resistance never died. Juárez and his government, still in Chihuahua, issued proclamations denouncing the foreign throne. Guerrilla fighters harassed French supply lines, ambushed convoys, and melted back into the rugged countryside. Entire communities, though too weak to face imperial troops in open battle, gave food and shelter to these partisans, sustaining the fight. The empire's expansion revealed another contradiction. Wherever Maximilian's progressive reforms touched, abolition of peonage, limits on forced labor, they stirred unrest among his conservative backers. Landowners and clergy grumbled that the emperor was undermining the very foundations of order. The peasants welcomed the decrees but distrusted the foreign monarch who signed them. Maximilian found himself in a lonely position. Too liberal for the reactionaries who had invited him, too monarchist for the republicans who resisted him. Yet, through 1865, the French army's discipline and firepower kept the empire intact. In Europe, Napoleon's prestige seemed secure. In Mexico, Maximilian convinced himself that time would heal divisions, that Mexicans would one day embrace him not as a foreign imposition, but as their rightful sovereign. But history was moving swiftly. Across the northern border, the Great American Civil War was grinding to its bloody conclusion. And once that storm ended, the winds would turn against Maximilian's fragile empire with devastating force. While French troops marched through Mexico's valleys and Maximilian held court in Chapultepec Castle, the northern horizon burned with another war. From 1861 to 1865, the United States was consumed by its own civil war, the bloodiest conflict in its history. For Napoleon III, that chaos was a gift. The United States, distracted and fractured, could not enforce the Monroe Doctrine, its long-standing warning that no European empire should meddle in the Americas. But in April 1865, the guns of the American Civil War finally fell silent. The Union emerged battered but unbroken, and President Andrew Johnson, like Lincoln before him, was determined to reassert U.S. influence. Across Washington's political circles, Mexico was no longer a distant concern but an urgent matter. A French-backed monarchy on America's southern border was intolerable. Almost immediately, American policy shifted. The Union Army, swollen with veterans and supplies, redeployed units to the Rio Grande. U.S. diplomats sent sharp warnings to Napoleon. The empire in Mexico violated the Monroe Doctrine, and America would not stand by. The United States did not yet declare war, but the message was clear: withdraw or face confrontation. Support for Juárez began to flow. Shipments of rifles, ammunition, and money crossed into northern Mexico. Republican fighters who had struggled for years with scant resources suddenly found themselves armed with American Springfield rifles and modern artillery. With this infusion of strength, Juárez's cause took on new life. For Maximilian, the timing could not have been worse. His empire was already strained, its legitimacy questioned, its reforms resented. Now the shadow of the United States loomed over every decision. The empire that had seemed secure under French protection was beginning to look like a fragile illusion. For Napoleon III, the calculation was changing. What had once been an easy gamble, seizing Mexico while America was distracted, was becoming a dangerous liability. France now faced the prospect of antagonizing not only Mexican Republicans but also a newly reunited superpower. The dream of a Latin empire in the New World was beginning to unravel. By 1866, the tide of war had turned. For years, Juárez's Republican forces had survived on grit alone: scattered militias, ragged uniforms, and outdated muskets. But now, with American rifles and gold flowing across the Rio Grande, the Republic was reborn. Veterans of the Union Army trained Mexican soldiers, while caravans of supplies fueled the resistance. What had once been a desperate struggle became a coordinated counteroffensive. Republican armies moved swiftly, reclaiming towns and provinces that had seemed lost to the empire. Cities in the north rose again under the tricolor of the Republic, and guerrilla bands across the countryside intensified their strikes. French patrols found themselves ambushed on mountain roads, convoys disappearing into flames, outposts overrun in the night. Morale shifted. The French soldiers, weary from years of occupation, began to sense the futility of their mission. Maximilian's imperial troops, Mexican conservatives who had once dreamed of restoring their old privileges, now faced a resurgent enemy backed by American might. Victory, once certain, now slipped through their fingers like sand. In Europe, the pressure mounted on Napoleon III. The United States stood firm, demanding French withdrawal. At home, the war had become unpopular, draining men and money for a cause that few in France truly cared about. Napoleon had entered Mexico seeking glory. By 1866, it had become a quagmire, threatening his own prestige. Reluctantly, he ordered French troops to begin their withdrawal. For Juárez, it was vindication. For Maximilian, it was betrayal. The foreign emperor, who had been promised France's eternal support, now found himself increasingly alone, his throne propped up only by dwindling Mexican imperial loyalists. Still, Maximilian refused to abdicate. He convinced himself that his reforms, his ideals, and his personal courage could hold the empire together. But the Republic was no longer a flicker in the dark. It was a flame sweeping across Mexico, and soon Maximilian would face it head-on. By the end of 1866, the dream that Napoleon III had spun in Paris lay in ruins. The French withdrawal had begun in earnest. Regiments that once paraded triumphantly through Mexico City now marched to Veracruz, boarding ships bound for home. Cannons were dismantled, flags furled, and columns that had once symbolized imperial power now looked like a retreat. For Napoleon, the decision was cold calculation. France could not afford to antagonize the United States, whose armies now stood watch along the Rio Grande. Domestic pressure also mounted. Critics in Paris decried the cost. Soldiers' families mourned the dead, and the emperor's prestige waned. What was supposed to be a dazzling victory for France had become a diplomatic embarrassment. By cutting his losses, Napoleon hoped to salvage his reputation in Europe, even if it meant abandoning his creation in Mexico. For Maximilian, the news was devastating. The emperor, who had crossed an ocean on the promise of eternal French support, now stood betrayed. His empire, never secure, was crumbling beneath him. Yet, when advisors urged him to abdicate and return to Europe, Maximilian refused. To leave, he declared, would dishonor the men who had fought and died for him. Perhaps more than that, it would dishonor the image he had built of himself, a reforming monarch chosen by destiny, devoted to his adopted nation. Carlotta, desperate to save the throne, sailed back to Europe to plead with Napoleon and the courts of Europe. She begged for aid, insisting that Maximilian's empire could yet survive. But in Paris, her pleas fell on deaf ears. In Vienna, her family urged Maximilian to abandon Mexico. Overwhelmed and exhausted, Carlotta suffered a mental collapse that left her unable to return. The emperor was now truly alone.
By early 1867, Maximilian's empire existed in name only. French soldiers were gone, European support evaporated, and Republican forces closed in from every side. Yet Maximilian, stubborn and romantic to the end, resolved to fight on. He retreated to the city of Querétaro, gathering the remnants of his loyalists, preparing to make his final stand. In the spring of 1867, the city of Querétaro became the last refuge of a crumbling empire. Behind its walls, Maximilian gathered the remnants of his loyalists, a few thousand imperial Mexican troops, some conservative officers, and the ghost of an empire that had once stretched from Veracruz to Jalisco. Outside, Republican forces closed the noose, their numbers swelling with each passing week. For months the siege dragged on. Hunger gnawed at soldiers and civilians alike. Disease spread through the narrow streets. Yet Maximilian refused to abandon the city. He walked among the trenches in his white uniform, speaking with the rank and file, assuring them that relief would come. To many of his soldiers, this stubborn emperor, foreign-born yet sharing their suffering, earned a measure of respect. But admiration could not change the outcome. In May, betrayal sealed his fate. A Mexican officer within the imperial ranks opened the gates to the Republicans. Querétaro fell. Maximilian, who had crossed an ocean dreaming of destiny, was taken prisoner. Juárez, steadfast in his commitment to the Republic, now faced a grave decision. The world watched to see whether the captured emperor would be spared or punished. European courts pleaded for clemency. Even Empress Carlotta, shattered by madness in Europe, could no longer fight for him. Juárez was unyielding. Mexico had bled too long, endured too many humiliations. To allow Maximilian to live, he feared, would leave open the door to another empire, another foreign intervention. A tribunal sentenced him to death. On the morning of June 19, 1867, Maximilian stood on a hillside outside Querétaro, flanked by two loyal generals, Tomás Mejía and Miguel Miramón. He faced the firing squad with calm dignity, offering gold coins to the soldiers and asking them to aim at his heart. "I forgive everyone," he declared. A volley of rifles cracked, and the dream of a Habsburg Mexico ended in smoke. With Maximilian's death, the Republic was restored. Juárez returned to Mexico City not as a fugitive, but as president, vindicated by history. For France, the intervention was a humiliation that stained Napoleon III's legacy. For Mexico, it was a victory purchased with blood, a reminder that the nation's sovereignty could not be dictated from abroad. Thus ended one of the strangest wars of the 19th century, a collision of empires and republics, of ideals and illusions, of ambition and resistance. From it emerged a Mexico scarred yet unbroken, and an emperor remembered not as a conqueror but as a tragic figure who chased destiny across the sea, only to meet his end before a Mexican firing squad.